Morning, fourth graders. Happy Wednesday. I hope you enjoyed your nice long weekend and got to play outside and enjoy the nice weather we had. Um, I know we had a couple of nice days in there. Anyway, I thought I would try doing something a little different with the borrowers. Instead of using my time with you when we meet to read aloud and then try and fit in some discussion or some questions, I thought perhaps I would read to you on my own and then you can then read and be ready to meet. And then when we meet, we could just talk about the book and maybe go over some of the other things that we were working on as well, such as some of your words and just chit chat about anything else that we wanted to touch base on. So let's try this. I will read to you. We left off with Arietti folding the letter and placing it in her book. And in there, she wrote in her diary that she went borrowing, and she said, "I wrote to H, talked to B," and that we had said the last time we read together that H stood for Hendrieri, her uncle Hendrieri, and B stood for um, boy. So let's pick up where we left off. And when I say boy, meaning obviously the boy that she saw in the grass, the one that had seen her when she went borrowing with her dad. So we left off with chapter 12. And I want you to just listen and hopefully create that movie in your mind as I read. Okay, but it was one thing to write a letter and quite another to find some means of getting it under the mat. Pod, for several days, could not be persuaded to go borrowing. He was well away on his yearly turnout of storerooms, mending partitions, and putting up new shelves. Arietti usually enjoyed the spring sorting, when half-forgotten treasures came to light and new uses were discovered for old borrowings. She loved turning over the scraps of silk or lace, the odd kid gloves, the pencil stubs, the rusty razor blades, the hairpins and the needles, the dried figs, the hazelnuts, the powdery bits of chocolate, and scarlet stubs of sealing wax. Pod one day had made her a hairbrush from a toothbrush, and Homily had made a small pair of Turkish bloomers for two glove fingers for knocking about in the mornings. There were spools and spools of colored silks and cottons and small different balls of odd wool, pen points which Homily used as flower scoops and bottle tops galore. But this year, Arietti banged about impatiently and stole away whenever she dared to stare through the grating, hopefully to see the boy. She now kept the letter She now kept the letter always with her, stuffed inside her jersey, and the edges became rubbed. Once he did run past the grating, and she saw his woolen stockings. He was making a chugging noise in his throat like some kind of engine. And as he turned the corner, he let out a piercing ooh ooh. It was a train whistle, he told her afterwards. So he did not hear her call. One evening after dark, she crept away and tried to open the first gate, but swing and tug as she might, she could not budge the pin. Homily, every time she swept the sitting room, would grumble about the carpet. "It may be a curtain and chair job," she would say to Pod, "but it wouldn't take you not a quarter of an hour with your pin and your name tape to fetch me a bit of blotting paper from the desk in the morning room. Anyone would think, looking at this floor, that we lived in a toad hole." "No one could call me house proud," said Homily. "You couldn't be, not with my kind of family. But I do like," she said, "to keep nice things nice." And at last, on the fourth day, Pod gave in. He laid down his hammer and said to Arietti, "Come along." I wonder what do you think he means when he says come along? Arietti was glad to see the morning room. The door luckily had been left ajar, so obviously they're going borrowing again. The door had the door had luckily been left ajar, and it was fascinating to stand at last in the thick pile of the carpet, gazing upward at the shelves and pillars and towering gables of the famous overmantel. So that's where they had lived, she thought, those pleasure-loving creatures, remote and self-sufficient, She imagined those overmantel women, those with a little Tweety, Homily had described them, with thin waists and piled hair, swinging carelessly outward on the pilasters, laughing and gazing at themselves in the inset looking glass, which looked back, which reflected back the tobacco jars and the cut glass decanters and the bookshelves and the plush covered table. I guess she was talking about how the women that stood over the mantle, remember, well, they all hung around in that morning room, how they all looked so fancy because they were obviously rich, and how they dressed and what they looked like and the things that they wore, and how they admired themselves when I said in the reflection, in the tobacco jars. So, the reflection that they see of themselves and how they admired themselves. She imagined the men, the overmantel men, fair, they were said to be, with long mustaches and nervous, slender hands, smoking and drinking and telling their witty tales. So they had never asked Homily up there. Poor Homily, with her bony nose and never tidy hair that would have looked at her strangely, Ariadne thought, with their long, half laughing eyes, and smiled a little, and humming, turned away. And they had lived only on breakfast food, on toast and egg and tiny snips of mushroom, sausage they'd have had, and crispy bacon and little sips of tea and coffee. Where are they now? Ariadne wondered. Where could such creatures go? So basically, she's saying if Homily had gone ever borrowing upstairs, that she probably would feel sad about herself because she doesn't ever look as nice. And they're saying her hair is always untidy and messy. And maybe, Homily is downstairs in charge of taking care of their little space down there. And kind of happy that her mom didn't ever had to go borrowing and get and see them and make herself feel bad. Okay. Um, Pod had flung his pin so it stuck into the seat of his chair and was up the leg in a trice, leaning outward on his tape. Then, pulling out the pin, he flung it like a javelin above his head into a fold of curtain. This is the moment, Ariadne thought, and felt for her precious letter. She slipped it into the hall. It was darker this time, with the front door closed, and she ran across it with a beating heart. The mat was heavy, but she lifted up that corner and slid her letter under by pushing with her foot. There, she said, and looked about her shadows and the ticking clock. She looked across the great plain of the floor to where, in the distance, the stairs mounted another world above, she thought, world on world, and shivered slightly. Ariadne, called Pod softly from the morning room, and she ran back in time to see him swing of the cleared seat and pull himself upward on the name tape, level with the desk. Lightly, he came down, feet apart, and saw him, for safety's sake, twist the name tape lightly around his wrist. I wanted you to see that, he said, a little breathless. The blotting paper, when he pushed it, floated down quite softly, riding lightly on the air, and lay at last some feet beyond the desk, pink and fresh on the carpet's dingy pile. You start rolling, whispered Pod. I'll be down. And Ariadne went on her knees and began to roll the paper until it grew too hard for her to hold. Pod soon finished it and lashed it with his name tape, through which he ran his hat pin, and together they carried the long cylinder, as two house painters would carry a ladder, under the clock and down the hole. Homily hardly thanked them. When panting a little, they dropped the bundle in the passage outside the sitting room door. She looked alarmed. There you are, she said. Thank goodness. Okay, I'm sorry, I stopped at a second. Homily. Oh wait, I lost my place. I'm sorry, guys. I had to pause that for a quick second, and now I'm just looking where I left off. Okay, I said that they carried it like two house painters would carry a ladder, under the clock and down the hole. Homily hardly thanked them when, panting a little, they dropped the bundle in the passage outside the sitting room door. She looked alarmed. There you are, she said. Thank goodness, that boy's about again. I've just heard Mrs. Driver talking to Crampfurl, cried Ariadne. Oh no, what did she say? Homily glanced sharply at her and saw that she looked pale. Ariadne realized she should have said, What boy? It was too late now. Nothing real bad, Homily went on, as though to reassure her. It's just a boy they have upstairs. It's nothing at all, but I heard Mrs. Driver say that she'd take a slipper to see him. I'm sorry, she would take a slipper to him, see if she wouldn't, if he had mats up once again in the hall. The mats up in the hall, echoed Ariadne. Yes, 3 days running, she said to Crampfurl. He'd had the mats up in the hall. She could tell, she said, by the dust and the way he'd put them back. It was the hall part that worried me, seeing as you and your father. What's the matter? Said Ariadne. There's no call for that sort of face. Come on now, help me move the furniture and we'll get down the carpet. Oh dear, thought Ariadne miserably as she helped her mother empty the matchbox chest of drawers. 3 days running. He's looked and nothing there. He'll give up hope now. He'll never look again. That evening, she stood for hours on a stool under the chute in their kitchen, pretending she was practicing to get a feeling when really she was listening to Mrs. Driver's conversations with Crampfurl. All she learned was that Mrs. Driver's feet were killing her, and that it was a pity that she hadn't given her notice last May, and that Crampfurl have another drop, considering there was more in the cellar than anyone would drink in her lifetime, if they thought she was going to clean the first floor windows single-handedly, and then had better think again. But on the third night, just as Ariadne had climbed down off the stool, before she overbalanced with weariness, she heard Crampfurl say, If you ask me, I'd say he had a ferret. And quickly Ariadne climbed back again, holding her breath. A ferret? She heard Mrs. Driver exclaim. Whatever next? Where would he keep a ferret? That I wouldn't like to say, said Crampfurl in his rumbling, earthy voice. All I know is he was up beyond Parkin's Beck, going round all the banks and calling like down all the rabbit holes. Well, I never, said Mrs. Driver. Where's your glass? Just a drop, said Crampfurl. That's enough. That goes to your liver. This sweet stuff is not like beer, is it? Yes, he went on. When he saw me coming with a gun, he pretended to be cutting a stick like from the hedge. But I'd seen him all right and heard him calling away, his nose down a rabbit hole. It's my belief he has a ferret. There was a gulp, and as though Crampfurl was taking a drink. Yes, he said at last, and Ariadne heard him set down his glass. A ferret called Uncle something. Ariadne made a sharp movement, balanced for one moment with her arms waving, and fell off the stool. There was a clatter, and the stool slid sideways and banged against a chest of drawers and rolled over. What was that? Asked Crampfurl. There was silence upstairs, and Ariadne held her breath. I didn't hear anything, said Mrs. Driver. Yes, said Crampfurl. It was under the floor, like by the stove. That's nothing, said Mrs. Driver. It's the coals falling. Often sounds like that. Scares you sometimes when you're sitting here alone. Here, pass your glass. There's only a drop left. You might as well finish it. They're drinking fine old Madeira, thought Ariadne, and very carefully she set the stool upright and stood quietly beside it, looking up. She could see the light through the crack, occasionally flicked with the shadow as one person or another moved his hand or arm. Yes, went on, returning to his story, and when I come up with me gun, he says, all innocent, to put me off, I shouldn't wonder that there's no ferrets around here. Well, there did used to be one. There used to be a ferret around here. In fact, well, two can play at that game, I thought. So I just sit myself down, and there we were, just the two of us. And what happened? Well, he had to go off in the end, leaving his ferret. I waited a bit, but it never came out. I poked around a bit. I whistled. Pity I never heard it properly, what he called it. Uncle something, it sounded like. Ariadne heard the sudden scrape of a chair. Well, said Crampfurl, I better get on now and shut those chickens up. The door banged, and there was a sudden clatter overhead as Mrs. Driver began to rake the stove. Ariadne replaced the stool and stole softly into the sitting room. where she had found her mother all alone. So that is the end of chapter 12. So when we meet, we can talk a little bit about what happened in this chapter and some of the things they were talking about and referring to. Was there really a ferret? And if not, what did they mean by that there was possibly a ferret? And who could they have been talking about? So we will chat at our meeting and just be prepared to talk about it then.